I do my best work under pressure. I don't need a script. I'll just read the room and improvise. We'll figure out the logistics when we scale. Listen to the absolute arrogance of the modern amateur. You have been infected by a culture that romanticizes adrenaline and worships spontaneous genius. You believe that when the pressure arrives, when the meeting starts, when the deal is on the table, when the crisis breaks open, you will rise to the occasion through sheer instinct and raw talent. You treat preparation as though it is a confession of weakness, something required only by the unconfident, something the truly gifted never need. You are completely wrong. Improvisation is not a sign of genius. It is a symptom of laziness, dressed in the language of confidence. Relying on your instincts in the middle of chaos is not a strategy. It is a desperate, last-minute gamble to compensate for the work you refused to do when the room was still quiet. You have confused the adrenaline of survival with the architecture of victory. They are not the same thing. One is a chemical reaction. The other is a decision made in silence, long before the battle begins. You do not rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the exact level of your preparation. Every single time. We dissect this delusion without sentiment, so we can see precisely what is operating beneath the surface of your own behavior. On the surface, the belief feels sophisticated. It sounds like self-awareness. You tell yourself that you are adaptable, that you read situations intuitively, that rigid planning cannot account for the chaos of real conditions. You have constructed an identity around your ability to think on your feet, and that identity feels like a competitive advantage. But examine what is actually happening in your brain during improvisation, and the architecture becomes far less flattering. When you enter a high-stakes situation without preparation, your prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for strategic reasoning, long-term planning, and disciplined decision-making, is immediately overwhelmed by your limbic system. The threat response activates. Cortisol floods your bloodstream. Your cognitive bandwidth, which was already finite, gets consumed almost entirely by the immediate task of managing your own emotional state. You are not thinking strategically. You are surviving. Every cognitive resource you possess is being burned just to keep you functional in the present moment, leaving nothing in reserve for the precision, the patience, and the calculated restraint that genuine high performance demands. Psychologists identify this as the improvisation delusion. The human brain is not designed to perform optimally under surprise. It is designed to survive under surprise. Survival and optimal performance are not the same state. When the brain operates under acute stress, without a prepared framework to execute, it defaults to pattern recognition built from past experience, which means it repeats whatever worked before, regardless of whether that approach fits the current situation. You are not adapting, you are recycling. And here's the mechanism that makes this delusion so persistent and so difficult to dismantle. The brain craves stimulation. Sitting alone in a quiet room for 40 hours, writing a contingency protocol, mapping every variable, calculating every failure point, produces no dopamine whatsoever. It is uncomfortable. It is tedious. It demands sustained cognitive effort with no immediate emotional reward. But walking into a room unprepared and talking your way through a crisis floods your system with adrenaline. The improvised recovery feels electric, and your brain, which cannot distinguish between the chemical signature of genuine excellence and the chemical signature of pure relief, labels that feeling as high performance. You call it hustle. You call it adaptability. You call it working well under pressure. A cold strategist calls it a catastrophic failure of architecture, rescued at enormous cost and then immediately misremembered as a triumph. To see what genuine preparation looks like when deployed against improvised genius at the highest possible stakes, we go to the early 19th century. We go to Europe. We examine Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, and the systematic dismantling of the most brilliant military improviser in modern history. Napoleon Bonaparte was the supreme improviser of his era. He was a man of sweeping intuition, breathtaking boldness, and an almost preternatural ability to read the chaos of a battlefield in real time and bend it to his will. He won through shock, through speed, through the sudden and overwhelming application of force at the precise moment his enemies least expected it. His genius was genuine. His record was extraordinary. Across 2 decades, he defeated army after army commanded by men who were older, more experienced, and fighting on their home territory. He was the living proof that improvised brilliance could defeat conventional preparation. Wellington was his absolute opposite in every respect that mattered. Wellington despised military romanticism with a cold and total contempt. He was not interested in glory. He was not interested in the mythology of the decisive charge or the inspired battlefield maneuver that turns the tide through sheer audacity. He was interested in one thing only: the precise, unglamorous, obsessive preparation that makes the outcome inevitable before the first soldier moves. While other commanders were dreaming of cavalry charges and the poetry of war, Wellington was calculating the exact weight of a soldier's daily beef and biscuit ration, and the precise number of supply wagons required to sustain an army of a given size, across a given terrain, over a given number of days. He knew that an army does not win because it is brave. An army wins because it is fed, rested, supplied, and standing on the correct piece of ground at the correct moment. And all of those conditions are produced by decisions made long before the enemy appears on the horizon. Wellington did not wait for a crisis and then respond with brilliance. He eliminated the possibility of certain crises entirely through preparation so thorough that they could not occur. Now, look at the Battle of Waterloo in June 1815. The romantic telling of that battle, the version that gets repeated in popular history, presents it as a dramatic and unpredictable collision of titans decided in the heat of the final hours by courage, by luck, by the late arrival of Prussian reinforcements. That version is emotionally satisfying. It is also strategically illiterate. Wellington had personally walked and studied the terrain at Waterloo long before the battle took place. He had identified the field not as a location where a battle might happen to occur, but as the specific ground where he had decided a battle would occur, on his terms, under conditions of his choosing. He had memorized the ridgelines, the approaches, the sight lines, the drainage patterns of the soil after rain, and he had identified a feature of that terrain that would become the decisive architectural element of the entire engagement: the reverse slope. Wellington positioned the bulk of his infantry not on the visible crest of the ridge facing the French lines, but behind it, on the downward slope of the far side, completely hidden from Napoleon's artillery. When the French cannons opened fire across the valley, the cannonballs that did not fall short absorbed harmlessly into the soft ground at the ridge crest. The ones that cleared the ridge flew over the heads of Wellington's soldiers entirely. His infantry sat in relative safety, invisible, waiting. Not because of inspiration, not because of instinct, because Wellington had done the geometric calculation in silence, in advance, on a quiet afternoon weeks before the armies arrived. Napoleon came to Waterloo to fight a battle. Wellington came to Waterloo to execute a script he had already written. That distinction is everything. Consider what this meant in practice, hour by hour. While Napoleon's staff spent the eve of battle managing the ordinary chaos of troop movements, supply confusion, and last-minute repositioning, Wellington's army was already settled into a position that had been chosen weeks earlier. There was no scramble. There was no improvised adjustment to unexpected terrain. Every regiment already knew where it stood and why. The absence of drama in Wellington's preparation is exactly what made the presence of drama unnecessary during the fight itself. He had already spent the tension. He had already burned the uncertainty. What remained on the day of battle was execution, not discovery. This is not military history offered as metaphor. The cognitive science is precise, and it is unambiguous. Research in performance psychology consistently demonstrates that under genuine high-pressure conditions, prepared individuals do not simply perform better than unprepared individuals. They operate in a qualitatively different cognitive state. When a prepared mind enters a high-stakes situation, it does not encounter the situation as a problem to be solved in real time. It encounters the situation as a pattern to be recognized and a protocol to be executed. The cognitive load drops dramatically. The emotional regulation required is minimal. The prefrontal cortex remains online. Strategic thinking remains available. The prepared individual is not spending their bandwidth on survival. They are spending it on precision. The unprepared individual is consuming everything they have just to remain functional. Studies on expert performance across disciplines, surgery, combat, negotiation, high-stakes athletics, reveal a consistent finding. What observers interpret as composure under pressure is almost never a personality trait. It is almost always the behavioral signature of exhaustive prior preparation. The surgeon who operates with apparent calm during a crisis is not calm because they are naturally unflappable. They are calm because they have rehearsed the response to that exact crisis scenario dozens or hundreds of times in controlled conditions. Their nervous system has already processed the threat. What looks like grace under pressure is the execution of a deeply rehearsed protocol. Wellington's reverse slope decision was not a stroke of battlefield inspiration. It was the output of a military mind that had spent decades studying terrain, studying artillery, studying the physics of projectile motion across varied ground conditions, and developing a systematic framework for converting geographic analysis into tactical advantage. The brilliance was real, but it was not spontaneous. It was the product of preparation so thorough and so sustained that it had become instinct, which is an entirely different category of instinct from the undisciplined gut reaction that the improvisation delusion celebrates. The gap between these two states is not talent. It is the accumulated weight of deliberate preparation deployed in advance of need. There is a further layer to this that is easy to miss. Preparation does not merely produce better decisions in the moment. It produces a smaller number of decisions that need to be made in the moment at all. Every variable Wellington mapped in advance, supply routes, terrain, sightlines, timing, was a decision he did not have to make under fire. By the time the battle began, the vast majority of the contest had already been decided by choices made in complete silence, with no clock running and no enemy watching. What looked like a battle fought in a single day was, in truth, a battle fought over months, most of it invisible, most of it finished long before the first shot. One of the more dangerous features of the improvisation delusion is that it is socially rewarded. The person who calmly walks into a chaotic meeting and produces an elegant answer on the spot is celebrated in the room. Nobody applauds the person who spent the previous 3 weekends quietly building the model, running the scenarios, and rehearsing the objections nobody else thought to ask. The visible performance gets the credit. The invisible preparation that made the performance possible gets none. This creates a perverse incentive. Because improvisation is visible and preparation is not, people learn, without ever consciously deciding to, that the improvised save is the thing worth cultivating, and the quiet, unglamorous preparatory work is optional. Over time, this produces professionals who are extremely good at recovering from self-created crises, and never notice that the crises were self-created in the first place. They mistake the skill of the rescue for the absence of a need to prevent the emergency. Wellington would have found this pattern of thinking contemptible. To him, a battle that required heroics to win was, by definition, a battle that had been poorly prepared. The goal was never to arrive at a thrilling contest of nerve. The goal was to arrive at a contest so thoroughly pre-decided that nerve became almost irrelevant. Drama, to Wellington, was not proof of skill. It was evidence of a planning failure that skill was now being asked to absorb. Now bring this architecture into the territory of your own life and examine it without the comfort of distance. Where are you currently improvising when you should be prepared? Where are you arriving to critical moments? the presentation, the negotiation, the difficult conversation, the high-stakes decision? Having done the minimum preparation necessary to survive, rather than the exhaustive preparation necessary to dominate. Where are you secretly proud of your ability to recover from crises that your own lack of preparation created? Identify the domains where you are most addicted to the adrenaline of emergency. These are not your strongest areas. They are your most exposed ones. The domains where you rely most heavily on improvisation are the domains where you have made the unconscious calculation that the discomfort of thorough preparation costs more than the risk of being unprepared. That calculation is always wrong. You are simply paying the cost at a moment of maximum inconvenience rather than a moment of your own choosing. Look at the relationships in your life. Are you improvising your communication? Saying whatever seems to manage the immediate emotional temperature of a conversation, rather than having done the prior work of understanding what you actually believe, what you actually need, and what you are actually willing to commit to. Improvised communication in high-stakes relationships does not produce connection. It produces a series of temporary agreements that collapse under any sustained pressure because they were never built on a prepared foundation. Look at your professional environment. Are you running on a strategy or running on momentum? Momentum feels like progress. It has the sensation of forward motion. But momentum without a prepared strategic framework is simply controlled falling. You are moving forward only because stopping would require you to confront the fact that you have not decided where you are actually going. Wellington did not simply respond to Napoleon. He chose the ground. He chose the conditions. He chose the timing. And he did all of that choosing in advance, in quiet, when there was no pressure and no urgency demanding his attention. The preparation was the strategy. The battle was merely the execution. Where are you choosing your ground in advance? And where are you simply showing up and hoping the terrain favors you? There are three practical disciplines that convert this understanding into an operating doctrine, and they must be built in order. The first is terrain mapping. Before any high-stakes event, a negotiation, a launch, a difficult conversation, write down every variable you can identify in advance. What the other party wants, what could go wrong, what information you are missing, what the worst realistic outcome looks like. This is not a 5-minute exercise. Wellington spent weeks walking ground he would only occupy for a single afternoon. The proportion matters. If the event itself will take an hour, the preparation should take considerably longer than an hour. The second is scenario rehearsal. Once the terrain is mapped, rehearse your response to the 2 or 3 most likely disruptions. Say the difficult sentence out loud before you need to say it in the room. Run the numbers before someone asks you for them live. The value of rehearsal is not that it predicts the future perfectly. It is that it moves the cognitive labor of construction out of the high-pressure moment and into a low-pressure one, so that under real pressure, you are only doing retrieval, not invention. The third is the elimination of preventable variables. Every contingency you can remove in advance, every ambiguity you can resolve before the moment arrives, is one less thing competing for your cognitive bandwidth when it matters most. Wellington did not leave his army's food supply to be figured out during the battle. He solved it in advance, so that on the day itself, hunger was simply not a variable anyone needed to think about. Ask, for every high-stakes situation you face, what am I currently planning to figure out live that I could actually resolve right now, in the quiet, while there is no clock running? Preparation is not a productivity technique. It is a philosophy of power. The law that governs every high-stakes domain of human performance is simple, and it does not yield to charm, talent, or good intentions. The outcome is determined before the contest begins. What happens in the visible arena, the meeting, the negotiation, the battle, the performance, is almost never decided by what happens in the visible arena. It is decided by what happened in the invisible hours of preparation that preceded it. The person who has done more of that invisible work arrives with an insurmountable structural advantage that no amount of in-the-moment brilliance can reliably overcome. This is why Wellington defeated Napoleon. Not because Wellington was more talented, not because Wellington was more intelligent, but because Wellington had done the work that Napoleon's mythology told him he did not need to do. Napoleon's genius was real, but it was the genius of the improviser. Extraordinary when conditions were fluid, catastrophically exposed when it met an opponent who had already decided the conditions in advance. Improvisation without preparation is not adaptability, it is exposure. It is the condition of a person who has arrived to a contest having refused to do the work required to compete at the level the contest demands. The adrenaline of improvised recovery is not a reward. It is the price of negligence, paid at the worst possible moment under the worst possible conditions. The person who prepares thoroughly does not experience less pressure than the person who improvises. They experience pressure that their preparation has already processed. The threat is familiar. The response is rehearsed. The outcome is, within the limits of controllable variables, already decided. Stop glorifying the late-night panic. Stop wearing the last-minute recovery as a badge of capability. If you are consistently relying on improvised brilliance to survive situations that thorough preparation would have made routine, you are not demonstrating talent. You are demonstrating that you have not yet made the decision to perform at the level you claim to be pursuing. The greatest victories in human history are not loud, spontaneous, or dramatic. They are quiet, meticulous, and decided weeks in advance by the person who had the discipline to do the math when nobody was watching and nothing was at stake. Wellington chose his ground before Napoleon knew the battle was coming. That is the only kind of advantage that is real. Every other kind is borrowed time. Map the terrain. Calculate the supplies. Anticipate the artillery. Do it now in the quiet before the pressure arrives and strips you of the cognitive bandwidth to do anything except survive. The script is written in advance or it is not written at all. Execute.